I remember where I was when I first heard about coronavirus. It wasn't called COVID-19 then. I was on the other side of the world on a cruise with Pam for our annual end-of-year excursion. And this virus thingy, it was a problem that was happening in China. Who would have thought then we'd be where we are today in a world with a worldwide pandemic, a recession, and so much political and social unrest? Today, those pre-COVID-19 days, back in January, they feel like a different lifetime. COVID upended everything, and still today, every new day brings a new shock. We had a lockdown in Victoria, the worst recession in a century, massive unemployment, business closures. But if you survey the confusing mess we're in, you've got to remember that none of it happened in a vacuum. Every event has parents, grandparents, siblings and cousins. These previous events, they planted the seeds, passed on their DNA and continue to influence what's happening today. To hope to make any sense of what's ahead for us, we first of all got to pay attention to a bunch of what were probably seemingly unrelated stories that began before any of us even heard of COVID-19, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today with leading demographer Simon Kirstenmacher. But don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. For as long as history has been recorded, spring follows winter, and even though each of us is going through our own winters at the moment, spring will follow. In fact, I'm putting my money on it. So let's have a chat with Simon about what got us where we are today and what's ahead. So welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's most trusted property commentator who has once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor. That's the fifth time he's won a similar award in the last 7 years.
If you were told in January what April 2020 would look like, you wouldn't have believed it, would you? If you were told in May that in August, September, stage 4 lockdown would still be here in Victoria, you wouldn't have believed it. So how do you begin to make sense of the future when things change so fast? That's what I'm going to be talking about today with leading demographer Simon Kirstenmacher. Simon is Director of Research at the Demographics Group. He's a columnist with The Australian, but he's globally recognised as a rising star in the field of data management and insights, and he's a regular guest on my podcast. Welcome, Simon.
Hi, Michael.
Now, Simon, the world today is so different from what anyone would have expected. How can we make sense of what's ahead? Now, I recently read a great article from Morgan Housel, who's one of my favourite social commentators. I first got to know him on Motley Fool, and now he writes for Collaborative Fund, a company he's associated with. And he explained that until we know where we've been, how can we actually figure out what's ahead? So, Simon, you're one of Australia's leading demographers. You're a social commentator. So I'd like to get some of your thoughts on the ideas that Morgan Housel put forward. So now I'm going to leave a link to the original article in the show notes so people who are listening to us may be interested. But let's have a look at the first point he made, Simon. He said, to understand why so many people are angry today in 2020, and I'm sensing that anger, you have to realise that half the world gained insight into how the other half lived at the very moment those halves were different economically, more than they'd ever been. In other words, what he's saying is that the gap between the haves and the have-nots have grown, but as people grew apart, suddenly they became more connected digitally and they suddenly realised what they have got or what they're missing, Simon.
And it's really such a bizarre situation that we're finding ourselves in, because if we think about the Australian income profile, we still think that we are distributed like a bell curve where, sure, there's some rich folks, there's some poor folks, but essentially most of us have middle-class incomes, middle-class dreams. That is very much not the case anymore. We are increasingly looking like a U rather than a bell curve, meaning we have very few people in the middle and more people on the top and more people on the bottom. So that means that the difference between the the Australians that you just see on the street are bigger than they were before. But at the same time, even though we also live in other suburbs, we segregate socioeconomically, but everybody is so close because with social media, you can actually get a snapshot into the life of other people. So at the same time, you are closer than ever before and further away from other people than ever before. And that really throws around the concept of social cohesion that we managed in Australia. We don't have different people in our workplaces anymore. The people that you tend to work with are essentially still of the same social class as you are. So we take away the opportunities for people to mingle with people that are not like them, like they are themselves. And that is a big problem, I would say, because how do you create social cohesion if you don't get to know people on a meaningful way? And of course, we interact with people who are richer or poorer than us. For example, if we order Uber Eats in, but that's not a meaningful interaction that we have with the person who hands us our dinner. That's really just a superficial interaction. We do need more meaningful contact with people, and it doesn't occur in everyday life anymore. It used to happen, for example, in church, where rich and poor people went to the same church, but in an increasingly atheistic society, that falls away. And I jokingly say that leaves the footy, or at least the gyms and sporting clubs, as the most important social institution in Australia, because these tend to be places where people from all walks of life interact around a common interest.
That's interesting. So while it's been said we're all in the same boat, we're not. We're actually in the same sea, but we're in different boats. And people are suddenly realizing this because COVID is separating us, and some people are suffering much more than others. In particular, the younger people seem to be suffering more, Simon.
Yes, I think that's a matter of the stage of the life cycle that you're in. When you are in your late teens and 20s, you are essentially out there trying to socialize. Your probably largest goal in life is to find a partner to spend your life with. So you are out and about, in bars, socializing, dating, or trying to date, trying to socialize. It's a crucial part of this stage of your life, and that is now a lot harder, or it's actually forbidden in a stage 4 lockdown city. So that can drive you mad, particularly if you live by yourself, or if you live in a shared housing arrangement with people that you are okay with but you're not really close friends with. I think that can actually really hit you hard. If you live with your family, your partner of many years, I think it's easier to cope. There are, of course, additional challenges if you have kids and you have to homeschool 3 kids in a 3-bedroom house. I think that can drive some people mad. But overall, I would say that particularly people in the young stage of the life cycle are hit a bit harder.
I think they're also going to have difficulty finding jobs. There are fewer jobs around, and they're probably not going to have as high an income earning capacity. Sometimes the wages will be lower, or wages growth may not be as high moving forward, Simon.
Absolutely. And yet again, it's a matter of not everybody is going to be hit equally hard. There are some industries that will recover faster than others. For example, if I'm looking at the construction industry, that will suffer because we have less migration after COVID. But if you position yourself in the right construction job, you will benefit from the infrastructure boom that I would be predicting once COVID is over, once we're hitting the recovery phase. We will spend heavily on infrastructure. If you manage to be in a job, in a company that is dealing in this space, you will be doing just fine. If you are solely focused on the construction of new 1-bedroom apartments, for example, you will struggle for a couple of years. It's a difficult way of predicting at the moment, a difficult task of predicting which areas of the economy will recover the fastest. But if I look, for example, at tourism, if I look at the arts, in particular, these are sectors that will take longer to recover than others.
Sure. So what we're doing is looking at an article by columnist and social commentator Morgan Housel about how we got here today, so we can maybe formulate some ideas about where we're going to move forward, how we're going to move forward once we get out of this. And the first thing he pointed out is we're noticing how different we are to others because of social media, and we're realizing that we're not all the same. The second point he made in his good article was that up until recently, working from home wasn't really an option. But look how things have changed. I mean, a century ago, a lot of people had more labour-intensive jobs. Now we've gone to more creative thinking jobs, well, particularly here in Australia where we've outsourced a lot of the manufacturing and the other jobs. So that's actually created a strong contrast between what can be done during a pandemic and those that can't. And there are still that two groups of people in Australia at the moment.
Oh, absolutely. If you take the really, really long-term perspective, we're talking a couple of 100 years back, then almost everybody worked from home. These were, of course, largely farmers. These were people who had very small-scale manufacturing operations at home. So everybody at if you look at the Black Death in Europe, everybody would have been working from home, essentially. So you could hide away, and the marketplace was the dangerous spot. And a pandemic in the industrial age was really difficult from the work perspective, because the jobs then were in factories and couldn't be done from home. But now we are in the transition. We are transitioning from the industrial manufacturing type economy to a service-based economy. And lots of the service jobs can actually be done from home. Essentially, if your job usually takes place in a big fat office tower, you can probably do that job from your home at the moment. But again, this really divides the Australian workforce into the people that can work from home, and there are challenges of getting Zoom to work, of managing a team remotely. Sure, these are all real challenges, but it at least means your job is probably able to continue in some way or form. Whereas other jobs just fall completely to the wayside. Those jobs in the arts, lots of hospitality jobs, they just fall away. And then there are the jobs where you are forced to work in a warehouse, in a factory, in an abattoir. And these were the areas of high COVID spread. And that's also where the low-paid jobs are. So we do provide an additional layer of socioeconomic segregation in the workforce.
It's interesting, a theme seems to be coming through this, that there are two groups of people, the haves and the have-nots, the harder workers with their physical activity and the more thought jobs. It's interesting because if this would have happened a decade ago, we probably wouldn't have been able to as seamlessly start working from home, working remotely, buying things online. I think it's also brought forward some trends that would have probably been occurring anyway, Simon.
Absolutely. The working from home trend, of course, was just probably put forward by 10, 15 years. We had, at the last census, we had 5% of the population working from home. And now, depending on what kind of survey you listen to, we do have about half of the workforce working from home. So this is a 10 times increase in the number of people that work from home. That's fantastic. And it shows to how resilient as a whole the Australian workforce actually was, that we can still operate. In Melbourne, many people still have their jobs, even though we're under an extreme lockdown situation. So that's a rather comfortable way of running an economy, if that is still possible. But yet again, essentially, you'd say the more highly skilled you are, the more high your income is, the more likely you are to actually be able to work from home. Yet again, the haves and have not, the winners and the losers of the pandemic. So we are risking very much to have a couple of people, a whole section of the population out there that will be hit extremely hard by this, because they have no or low income for a prolonged period of time. And even falling house prices wouldn't be able to buffer that fall easily.
That's unfortunate, because that is one of the reasons there is more social unrest and there's anger there. And I'm sensing a bit of anger out there at the moment. I guess another reason is, and that was mentioned in this article by Morgan Housel, that we've had it pretty good for a long time. No one foresaw a pandemic. I know Bill Gates spoke about it a number of years ago, but a setback just seems so overwhelming, because we just thought, hey, life's good. We're in the lucky country. That's happening to them over there in third world countries. We're not going to be struck by these things.
Absolutely. 28 years of continued economic growth in Australia. Maybe you could say we've just gotten a bit too used to it. But again, you always work with whatever the environment gives you. And now we are having to deal with this. And I think this will actually be the end of the kind of boring narrative that happened beforehand during the boom times where we said, the millennials are our generation that is very complacent, that are not very driven. And that's simply because as a generation, millennials weren't tested. Now all the generations are tested simultaneously, but you tend to only rise to the occasion once the occasion is presented to you. You don't show your true grit out of nowhere. It always shows itself by necessity. And I think that's just one of those examples, if that makes sense.
I'm a different generation to you, but I was the first generation in Australia that got polio vaccine. Generations older than me suffered from polio, and I remember children at school a year or two above me had deformities and had issues because of that. But when I grew up, you used to get mumps and measles and chickenpox and German measles, and you had little pandemics or epidemics of those, I guess, not pandemic. And then all of a sudden, all our kids are now getting these vaccines, and the worst we've sort of had was the Asian flu that happened over there, or swine flu, which we didn't really get much here. So this has really come out of the blue, but it's probable that it's going to get rid of our complacency. We were feeling complacent. I believe now we're going to probably think differently moving forward. We're going to be, well, looking out for some of these X factors, these black swan events.
Oh, absolutely. I think once you lived through an event like this, your perception of risk, of what is actually possible, is changing. I know this from my grandparent generation who lived through the late stages of the war, and that just changes your perceptions. If you lived for a decade in a struggling country with limited products available, that it changes the way that you think. And this is not a statement of good or bad. This is a statement of you adjust to the realities that are out there. And I'm very glad that we lived in a society, in a democracy that very carefully looked after its citizens, where we ensure that everybody is being vaccinated against the vast number of diseases that are out there. In an autocratic system, people aren't that kind to their citizens. They're not providing vaccines at the level that we do, and there is just much more suffering. Even though we are now suffering economically, the whole lockdown is actually done by a democratic government in order to help the population, and it's actually overall a kind thing to do, even though it will set us back financially. But there's no way of ignoring a pandemic sweeping through your country.
No, there isn't. And we're feeling it and we're hurting at the moment. But my guess is that moving forward, when our grandchildren, or my grandchildren are already much older than your child, but when your grandchildren learn about this, the world of 2020, it's probably just going to be a single page in history books, another deadly pandemic wedged in between a long list of other tragedies, Simon. But here we are in 2020, and to us, it's real.
Oh, it's definitely a real story for us, and you can see that this is already from the impact. How you feel it personally is way bigger than events like 9/11 or all the other events that were just already penciled into the history books of tomorrow as the big changing events of this millennium so far. So it does change, and the best interpretation, it's really a way of putting us all into the same boat collectively. It's really an experience that everybody shares. When you talk to people in Buenos Aires, in South Korea, in Germany, in the United States, they all tell the same story. And it's the first time, really, I would say, that we have a really global event that everybody feels at the same time and can connect over. And maybe that's one of the ways that we can increase our empathy towards other people, so that we can actually understand what this might feel like to be isolated, to be locked into your home, to have certain freedoms that you take for granted taken away. So I hope maybe it's a uniting, globally, from a global perspective, it's a uniting force as well.
That leads us into the next point, Simon, of Morgan Housel's, where he said local news gave way to national news, which gave way to global news, which makes the world feel perpetually broken because there's always a tragedy somewhere, and now you're guaranteed to hear about it. Unfortunately, as we've said in previous chats, bad news seems to get more attention than good news because pessimism is seductive. It feels more urgent than optimism.
Yeah, and there's a general problem with news. If there's something bad and tragic, you can't ignore it. That's hard to do because it would feel disingenuous to not report on a gruesome murder. You feel like you have to report it, and you do. But if you live in a country that's large enough, and Australia is large enough, you should, for example, have a murder every day of the year. That is to be expected. And so it doesn't matter whether there are 365 murders or whether there are 10,000 murders a year. You have a murder to report every single year. So that makes you just, no matter how many murders there are, you always think there is murder and cruelty out there in the world. So that's why I always go back to basic statistics and say you always have to put a horrible event, be it a pandemic, be it murder, be it crime, you need to put it into perspective, into the longitudinal perspective, into the historical perspective to understand how bad something actually is. Even though the individual event in its own right will always be horrible. One murder is a murder too many, but we do need to get the sense, the intuitive feel for data right in order to understand how bad something actually is and how we need to feel about it.
Now, the last point Morgan Housel made in this good article about let's have a look at how we got here so we can talk about what's moving forward is how our central banks around the world have learned to cope with something like this. So there is Federal Reserve in the US, the Reserve Bank here, central banks all over the world have actually kept the financial system from falling apart this time. I remember during the global financial crisis, it was lack of credit, illiquidity that created some of the issues there. But at the moment, they've kept the economies humming. They've given unprecedented support to business, to industries, to people. And that's ruined a lot of assumptions for many people about how the economy works.
We're not quite sure just yet. Again, how much smoke and mirrors there are in the stock market, for example. How will this play out? Because the stock market never really shows the current value of anything. It shows our perception of the future. And if I'm reading the news, if I'm seeing how people are talking about the pandemic, overall, we are incredibly optimistic as a people, because we do assume that we will find a solution to get COVID under control, to get our economy back to pre-COVID workings in no time. And that's quite amazing to see how optimistic and how willing we are as a people to actually stand behind this and to work through this crisis. And the stock market should probably picture this in a fair way. We've seen a bit of a hit, but no catastrophic decline, which is amazing if you think about it.
You're right. The world, the big money, the people who are paid a lot more than you and me to understand where our future's heading are actually putting money, they're backing the fact that spring will come after winter, like it does every year. So we are going through winter, some of us through a social winter, some of us through an economic winter, some of us through a health winter. But Simon, for as long as history's gone on, spring has come after winter. So I'm also prepared to put my money onto the fact that spring's going to come after this winter.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a matter of understanding when markets will turn, when growth will return to Australia. We do know that as long as the pandemic is raging, that we won't see high migration numbers, for example. But we can be pretty certain that as soon as international travel is okay, Australia will do anything in order to get, for example, international students back into the country. They would then help the education sector massively. They would also help restaurants in the inner cities where they tend to be housed massively. So that's a almost safe bet to be looking at. We won't see as much skilled migration for a couple of years because we will have a very high unemployment in Australia, higher unemployment than in many decades. So we don't need skilled migration from external sources. But it also means that once the economy gets back into rhythm, we do have local talent available. And then it's just a matter of training people appropriately, which then means, we pour a bit more money into the TAFE sector, into the university sector to get people better trained. And that is also a healthy long-term investment for our really long-term outlook in Australia. So I don't think it will be damaging to Australia or to people in this really not never-ending way that you sometimes read about. We say, the earning capacity of the people that are entering the workforce now will be damaged forever and ever. I don't think it will be, actually. I think that you have to deal with an annoying work environment for a couple of years, and that's it. Then we will be back to normal, and you can make up for lost time.
It's like a terrorist attack, and you've got to have a plan to get through this, and we will get through this, and this too shall pass. It's hard to make sense of the world at the moment. It's a world that we would not have seemed fathomable, couldn't have imagined this 20 years ago. In fact, we couldn't have imagined how we're doing it even a year or so ago. But here we are, and we'll be back again next month, Simon, to make some commentary on what's going on in the world. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for having me.
In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you, and I'm going to tell you 11 good things about getting older. And even if you're still young, and I bet most people listening to this are much younger than me, maybe there'll be some lessons, some wisdom from somebody who's a bit older than you. And yeah, there are some good things about getting old, no doubt about it. But before I get on to that, I'd just like to follow up with the chat I've just had with Simon, pointing out that this too shall pass, and we will get through this, and by understanding where we've been will help us a little bit about moving forward, and life will be different, but many things are still going to remain the same. And one thing that's going to remain the same is that a lot of people listening to this podcast are going to want to become more successful in life, financially and in other ways. I guess that's part of the reason you're listening to this podcast. And if you're a bit uncertain about what's going on and what to do, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole to get some direction, to get some certainty in these uncertain times. Now, you may not be ready to get involved in property, but we offer a lot more than that, and it's a good time to get your ducks in a row. So go to metropole.com.au and find out more about what we do. There'll be a link in the show notes, but we give strategic wealth advice. Now, a lot of it has to do with property, but we have a financial planning arm, renovations, development, buyer's agency, property management. So there's lots of ways we help our clients, but one of the things we don't do is we don't sell property, which means that the advice we give is independent and unbiased. And since we're in all the big capital cities, we are not particularly focused on one particular area or one particular product. So again, we can give you the right advice, holistic advice, to help you grow, protect and pass on your wealth. Go to metropole.com.au. I'd love to be part of your wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message to you today, I'd like to share with you 11 positive things about getting older that no one really tells you about. And now that I'm a bit older than most of the people listening to this podcast, and maybe over the years I've become a little bit wiser, I've realised that life's a journey of lessons. It's a journey of experiences. It contains successes, and boy does it contain mistakes along the way. And of course, there's lots of great things about getting older that no one tells you about, so I'd like to share 11 of those with you. Hey, maybe it'll give you something to look forward to. The first thing I'd like to share with you is I've learned you don't always have to be right. I remember when I was young, it was really important to be right. Well, as the years passed by, I began to understand it's often better to lose a few battles in order to win the war. So I've chosen which battles to fight and which not. Sometimes it's better to be happy than to be right. The second lesson I've learned is not to judge. You see, early on in life, we tend to want material things. We tend to strive for more things. But as we get older, we realise that stuff isn't as important as people and relationships. And we learn not to judge, but to accept people as they are. Another lesson as you get older is you begin to want less. We accumulate so much stuff on our journey through life, and much of it's redundant and in excess of what we actually need. So as we get older, we begin to realise that sometimes less is more. It's an incremental understanding that we don't need to surround ourselves with a whole lot of material things. Another lesson I've learned along the way is you gain more confidence in making decisions as you get older. It's true that age does bring wisdom, but it also does bring confidence. Now, why? I guess it's because as we get older, we accumulate experiences, and our life lessons are powerful tools to draw from when making future decisions. We've made the mistakes, but we've also learned from them, or I hope I have, and this instills an innate confidence for future decision making. As I go through these life lessons that no one teaches you about, some of the good things about getting older, it's one that your children become your friends. It's hard to think of our children as friends when they're first so dependent upon us, and then they become a bit more rebellious, and there's a period of time where they wonder about you, sometimes even hate you during the teenage years. What nobody tells you is that as they become adults, they grow their own lives and fulfill their own dreams. We as parents take on a different role. Children now return to the family home as individuals in their own right and as friends, and I'm very proud of the relationship I've got with my 4 children. I've also learned along the way that you understand there's no point in telling anyone what to do. At a certain age, you realise there's no point in telling others what to do. Actually, if you think about it, being given advice you didn't ask for never felt nice anyway. Yet I'm still seeing lots of people trolling me on YouTube, in particular, trying to tell me, push to me, their points of view. As you get older, you also learn that wrinkles should be worn with pride. Later in life, we realise that we're fortunate to be growing older and that wrinkles stand for a testimony to our experiences. It shows that we've successfully navigated the troughs and the peaks of life. So wrinkles represent the days of our life, each telling a different story. A couple more things I'd like to share with you that I've learned that are good about getting older. And one is we're able to treat our parents with unconditional respect. Now, unfortunately, I've now lost both my parents. They've passed away. But as you get older, our parents, although we love them, may have driven us mad at some points in our lives. And for those of us with children ourselves, isn't it interesting? The pattern's repeated. And as we get older, we learn to treat our mothers and fathers with respect and how to have patience as they reach the autumn years, because we've got a better understanding of the trials and tribulations that they've gone through in their own process of ageing. Another lesson I've learned, a good thing about getting older, is it's okay to play the fool again. You know, as children we laughed, we played the fool and generally didn't think too much about what other people thought of us. Then our egos developed, self-awareness set in, and we began to rein in our inner child and squash that idiosyncratic part of us that was once so spontaneous. Then when we reach a certain age, it begins to matter a lot less what other people think, and not taking ourselves so seriously becomes an option once again. There's 2 more good things I'd like to share with you that I've learned about getting older, and one is you learn not to criticise. As we get older, we learn there's little value being gained in criticising anyone else. If we need to say something, it's far better to say something positive than to dwell upon the negative. And the last good thing I'd like to share with you today about getting older is that you're thankful for growing old, because not everyone grows old. Many die before their time or in their primes of their life, and I've seen a number of my friends and professional colleagues who are no longer with us anymore. So with age comes gratitude and the knowledge that with every passing year we're privileged, and being grateful becomes a daily ritual that enhances our lives in so many positive ways. So I hope that my reminiscing has given you some hope for your future as you get older, because things do get better. No matter what's happening with your life at the moment, take a positive outlook, take control of your circumstances, and remember, the best is yet to come. As we're getting to the end of another episode of this podcast, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I hope you got some insights that's going to give you a bit of clarity in these challenging times. And if you did get some benefit, please tell somebody about the show, or use the share button on the podcast app, or tell the world by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this. If you'd like to keep in contact in between these twice-a-week podcasts, just look for Michael Yardney on any of the social media platforms, or subscribe to my daily property update newsletter. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?